Okay, welcome back to 289-106, Introduction to Game Technologies. This lecture is about narrative in games. Narrative in games. So there's a couple different types of story that you'll find in games. You'll find story-free games, which are usually abstract games, such as Tetris, in which there's no explicit underlying narrative to the game. It tends to be just gameplay without any particular narrative developed into it. Now, later in this lecture, I'm going to argue that there is a built-in narrative to even games like this. But for now, let's just say that there's no built-in narrative to these story-free games. There is, opportunities for narrative to develop. There's back in 2016, the company got funded to make a Tetris movie trilogy. And this is the log line. In the future, the year 3000 something, mankind has finally reached the ability to travel at light speed using block-like spaceships called tetroids. Deep in the universe lies the question to a human existence. Could the tetroids be the answer? It sounds like a terrible movie or three movies, but it was funded. Not sure if anything has happened since then. It's pretty much dead in the water as far as I can tell. Now, there are story-based games as well, and these games do have an explicit narrative within the game. And most likely you've played some of these games in which you progress as a character and you engage with a given narrative or story that is developed by the game designer. This is Shadows of the Colossus, by the way, which if you haven't played, you should absolutely play. It's an amazing game. And some of this narrative can get really quite complicated and sophisticated with a lot of depth and resonance and character development. Which is quite impressive. However, at some point in time, as you're engaging with this narrative, how is it different than a book? Why not just read the book? What is it about game and that makes that narrative different than the process of reading books? And indeed, books have been made from games. It's a kind of a common thing to do now, where you take the narrative of gameplay and you turn it into a book, which is non-interactive, straightforward, linear stuff. So why not read the book? And I think that anyone who has played a game is pretty explicit why you wouldn't necessarily just read the book. There's decision making, there's participation, engagement, there's pretty pictures and lovely noises and sounds and stuff like that. But ultimately, again, it's that idea of player agency and choice that makes gameplay narrative engaging in a different way than, say, watching Game of Thrones on TV or reading a really good book. So I think we can all agree that narrative in games is different than narratives in linear media. And I think that's fairly straightforward. So instead of going deeper into that, because I think it's fairly straightforward, but feel free to have a discussion about it if you don't feel like it is. But instead, I'd like to talk about two other aspects of gameplay and narrative, or narrative and gameplay, that I think is interesting and relevant to you guys as game developers. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is ableism. And specifically, does a game narrative exist if I'm unable to access it? So if there is this whole beautiful structure of narrative that's been developed, but I never get to it, either through my own choices or through my own ability, then does that exist? I mean, does that narrative mean anything? And a good example, again, for me personally, would be Shadows of the Colossus, where I think it's the 9th or 10th boss is called Dirge. And it was basically, for me, impossible to beat this level. And hopefully you guys, not hopefully, but probably you guys have all met with a boss or a particular level that's just really, really, really difficult, if not impossible for you to beat. Everything beyond that point becomes null, like you're just going to put the game down. And you've lost all of that narrative. Carefully crafted narrative, carefully crafted dialogue, but also the arc of those characters and the arcs of those narratives gets truncated at a particular point, and ultimately, for me at least, it's a highly unsatisfactory experience. It's an incredibly frustrating experience because I know there is more narrative, there's more story in there that I am completely unable to access. And at that point in time, does it even matter that it's there or not? So I'm going to talk about ableism not only in terms of difficulty level, but also in terms of a greater sense of ableism. I don't know if you guys have seen, this is an Xbox controller. Probably doesn't look like the Xbox controller that you're used to, but this is for people who are differently abled to be able to play the same games that we are playing, for those people who are able to do so. So there's larger buttons, the D-pad is significantly larger. There's other systems like this one, which is for paraplegics or people who have very little control over their own body. And we're just going to watch a little bit of this. So gamers who might not have any mobility at all, and they are still able to play games and excel at games using these hardware, using these devices, which is quite remarkable. And there's whole companies and charities that are set up in order to make games accessible to everybody who are differently abled. So please, I recommend taking a look at these two websites. I'll post them in stream. Have a wander around because it's really, really interesting, and it's really, really worthwhile to consider who might be playing your games and how they might have different abilities than what you might have yourself. Now, in both of these sites, they're very explicit when they're talking to game developers that providing access to your games and adapting the challenge changes your game. But we are not saying that you should limit or water down the experience your game offers. If you want your game to offer the edge of the seat tension of stalking a wild animal through the forest, then that's the player experience you should be aiming for. What APX, which is this framework that able gamers have developed to help developers make their games accessible, what APX offers is a way to think about whether you can provide that experience, so that provide that same experience to players with different types of disabilities. And they do this through a couple different things. And again, I'll post this on stream, and you guys should take a look. But there's several challenges, accessibility, and then game development challenges that they pose in order to help you think about your audience and broaden that audience to people who might be differently abled. Okay, 2, the other thing that I would like to talk about is this idea of narrative and where narrative exists in gameplay. Because I would like to argue that there is a game like Red Dead Redemption 2 might have a narrative built into the game, but I would also argue that there's a meta-narrative at operation whenever anyone plays a game. And going back to Tetris, this is where the narrative of a non-story based game operates, is in this idea of meta-narrative, which is the story of playing the game. And the example that I want to give is this. You might recognize it. This is the classic YouTube clip, Leroy Jenkins. And if you've never seen it before, basically it's there's these group of people online, and they're about to have a boss fight, a raid, and they're carefully planning, and they're going through all this. And as they're going through all their planning, all of a sudden one of the players, Leroy Jenkins, just starts off. He just shouts his name, and then off he goes and starts the whole boss fight. And it's a disaster, and they get destroyed. Now, we all have a Leroy Jenkins. We all have a story that we have played a game, or that we know someone who played a game, that the manner in which they play the game becomes the story itself. Now, this will happen quite a lot with multiplayer games, where you have the human element changing the narrative, where you have different people participating in the creation of the narrative, and that's always going to change the outcome of the in-game narrative and generate this other story that gets told. So for me, I beat Diablo. Like that's one of the seminal moments in my experience of gameplay, where it was the first time in a AAA title. This is an ancient game. This is probably back in '93 or something like that, and it was one of the first games that I actually beat completely. And it has no relevance to you at all, but it has a great deal of relevance to me. The way in which I played that game and how I managed to beat it. So to kind of unpack what I mean by this meta narrative, I want to talk a little bit about how it works in relation to game narrative. So you've got game narrative, which is the story, and again, it's a story within the game. It's diegetic. It has a start and it has an end, which happens within the game itself. And that might be, very simplified. Micah kills Arthur. There's a story, a plot point, and things happen. Now you also have this meta narrative that exists as you play the game. And one of the cool things about it is that it continues to exist after the game is done. So that might be the story in which you played the game. Like, what choices did you make to end up at the point where Micah kills Arthur instead of sparing Arthur? And it might be, I just kept robbing and killing lawmen and looting and doing all sorts of bad stuff, and people kept seeing me, and the lawmen kept coming after me. And so the story that gets developed outside of the actual plot points in the game becomes this meta narrative. And this meta narrative is something that you can tell. Like, it's another story you can tell. And this is kind of where it's different than linear storytelling. If you watch the Game of Thrones, for example, you're not going to talk about the way you watched Game of Thrones with your friends. You might talk about the in-game or the in story narrative of the linear experience. Not the linear experience, but the linear story of Game of Thrones. You might talk about the plot points, but you're not going to sit there and say, you know what? And then I ate some chocolate, and oh my God, it's a little bit dribbled out of my mouth, and then I had to clean up, and then I couldn't. Like, you're not going to talk about the way in which you watched a TV show. You're not going to talk about the way in which you slowly flipped the page of the book. You might talk about the content of the book and the content of that TV show. But game is quite unique in terms of the way that you play the game generates this secondary narrative. And that's often what you're going to talk about with your friends, and you're going to communicate that, and it becomes a point of value for you. It also means that you can go back and play the game and replay the game and generate a completely different meta narrative from the alternative ways that you've made this game. Now, the question that I have for you, between those two narratives, the meta narrative or the narrative, which is more important? Which is more important as a developer to develop? Is it more important to get a really, really good narrative that's branching and full of depth if a good 1/10, if the gamer is only ever going to experience 1/10 of that narrative? Is it more important to develop a way for a player to generate really interesting gameplay, which generates interesting meta narrative, and that meta narrative carries on with that? So again, this is kind of a hypothetical question, but I want to leave you with this in question, in terms of, again, what is more important, creating a really strong narrative or creating a really strong meta narrative, or a process of generating a meta narrative, and to whom is it important? Like, as a developer, it might be really, really important for you to have an extensive background to every character and every you know location or prop that might be in the game. Player can care less about all that stuff. They care more about the gameplay itself and the generation of that meta narrative. But it's going to be your call. As the developer, you'll play around with those things. I do want to remind you that I beat Diablo. All right, so where next? Where does narrative go from here? And as developers, where can we take narrative? And I just kind of want to leave you again with something dangling out there, a little hypothetical, and that's this idea of generative story. At the moment, the vast majority of games that do have a narrative, that narrative is very explicitly developed. However, there's a lot of people who are researching ways of creating generative story, and this is not generative dialogue, which is different. This is generative story. It's the idea of creating strongly structured narratives in a dynamic way. And it's been touched on with things like the Fable series. Let's see, there's been a bunch of other ones that kind of touch on this idea of using ethics to determine narrative. Bastion was another one, and for sure the most recent Red Dead Redemption games that take your ethical choices and change the narrative. But it's going a step further in terms of uh, generating new characters based upon your choices. So as opposed to just a usual stable of characters, they can generate new characters or generate new roles for those characters to play. And eventually, we'll see completely unique stories uh, from each iteration of a game being played. Um, and at that point in time, what becomes interesting for me is the value of collective versus unique storytelling. If the game that I play is completely unique, there's very little that I can talk about with someone else who has played the same game. So that meta narrative becomes something that actually doesn't have currency anymore because it's only valuable for me. I can't go to someone and say, I played that game and this is what happens because they had a completely different experience of that game. There's no collective shared experience there anymore that makes meta narrative valuable and useful. So again, this is just a hypothetical I want to throw out there in terms of as we develop these games that become more and more generative and more procedural and more unique. At what point in time does that mean that our collective experience of that title lose its value because of the extreme uniqueness to that story? Okay, that's all I got. Jump on Discord or stream. What I'd like you guys to do is, again, just talk about those stories that you have in your life that the way you played a game made the gameplay itself, like made that experience unique, made that experience something special and worthwhile. Um, and let's see where you guys are coming from with that. Okay. Uh, Nice to talk to you guys, and we'll see you later.